YouTube says I'm live, so I guess we're ready to go on this post-game stream podcast after Pitt's loss at Florida State, 82-67. By the time things ended, it didn't even feel like a 15-point game, and, well, that's what we're here to talk about. Hopefully you guys can come in and check it out. This podcast will be a little bit unique because we're talking right after a game. They really kind of screwed us up with the time of this game. This was right in the middle of our, right in the middle of our podcast taping hour. So I said, all right, well, let's do the podcast after the game. I thought it'd be an interesting game that we could talk about and have a little conversation. I didn't exactly expect it to go the way it did, and yeah, it's about as well, I mean, you saw it. Actually, I don't know if you saw it or not. The game was on the ACC network, so I know there's a lot of you who can't actually see that game. And so that's what we're here to do on the Panther-Lair podcast. You may not have been able to watch the game, but you can get on YouTube and you can talk about it here on the live stream of the Panther-Lair podcast as we try and figure out what happened to Pitt. But it's not even really about figuring it out anymore at this point, right? I mean, we've seen them play how many games now? I mean, we know, who this team is. I mean, we've seen enough of this team, and maybe they give us little flashes or moments to make us think that, things are not what they have seemed to be for the bulk of, at least recently in this season. But, I mean, they are who they are, right? And we've seen that, and certainly we saw them at their worst. When this little 3-game stretch that they just wrapped up, Georgia Tech, Clemson, and Virginia Tech, they only went 1-2 in that stretch. You could even throw in the Notre Dame game before that, even though that game was on the road. But to go 1-2 against Georgia Tech and Clemson, Virginia Tech, and then follow that up with a trip to, Tallahassee to take on, arguably the best team in the ACC this season, maybe not even arguably. I mean, I think it might be pretty clear that Florida State's the best team in the ACC. Play them in a building where they have not lost this season. Yeah, I think the outcome was probably expected. And yet somehow it was worse than expected. And maybe part of the reason it was worse than expected is because early in the game, and you can see if you want to get a look at what it's like on the inside, this is the game. Or at least the better part of the first half. The half ends here, so that's the first half, the better part of it. And certainly the better part of the game if you want to use better as a comparison. And I made a note to myself at the 3:07 media timeout, and I said, Capel knows Pitt can win, and he couldn't let the game slip away. And what I was writing about there is that Capel put Xavier Johnson, Au'Diese Toney, and Justin Champagnie back in the game despite having 2 fouls each. And I thought, boy, that's risky. I mean, these are 3 of your best players, and you're putting them back in the game despite these guys having potential foul trouble, or not potential. I mean, despite these guys having foul trouble, and you're running a risk because he brought him back in with 6 minutes to go. 6.5 minutes to go in the first half. All 3 of those guys playing with 2 fouls, and I said, boy, that's a gamble by Jeff Capel, but he knows that he had a chance to win the game, that he knew that Pitt could win the game. And at that point, I think when those guys came back in, Pitt was down by 5 or 7 or something like that, and he didn't want the game to get away. He wanted to take that risk. He wanted to gamble because he didn't want the game to get away, and so he put his best players back on the court, and it largely paid off. They go into halftime down 38-33, but I mean, they're competitive. They even take a lead, 29-28, with about 3 minutes left to go in the first half. Their final lead of the game, as it were. But the gamble paid off for Capel, and there were a lot of things to point to in those first 20 minutes that you say, all right, this team, they can be competitive with the better teams in the ACC. When they're playing at their best, when they're having a good night, when they're doing the things they're supposed to do, they can be competitive. But once again, the bad side of the team reared its ugly head, and we saw that they still have trouble sustaining that. We saw that these guards are still just not playing well enough. And I'm past the point of talking about consistency. When Xavier Johnson and Trey McGowan go 3 of 21 in a game, McGowan goes 0 of 7 from the floor, and Johnson's 3 of 14, and they turn it over 8 times. That's not about consistency. That's just bad play. It was just bad play. At some point this season, it had to move past being a one-trick pony. It had to move past just driving into contact every time. Trey McGowan's, when he only has 4 free throws, boy, he doesn't do as well against Florida State, does he? And they had things working in the first half. Adese Toney's making some baskets. Terrell Brown is playing really well. And they just couldn't sustain any of it. Champagny had to miss a bunch of minutes in the first half because of his foul trouble, but he came back in and made an impact, and I think helped Pitt, get back into the game in the first half, but none of it was sustainable, as has been the case all too often as they've moved through the ACC this season. And we are live streaming the game here on YouTube, and if you are watching, and I hope you are, you can comment and chime in on the conversation and talk about the game. Scott Lynch asked, have Trey McGowan and Xavier Johnson improved this year, and they haven't. Where would you say those guys have improved this season? I think you'd be hard pressed to find any area where they're playing better than they did last year. And that's not to say that they are worse, although Grant D says Trey has regressed. I just don't think they've gotten any better. I think they're still doing the same things they did a year ago, and they did it well a year ago. But I don't think they haven't improved. They haven't taken steps forward, which is what you really hope to see go, but actually improving and getting better and adding to their game. And instead of adding to their game, they've just got the same game. And it is, Scott Lynch, follows up by saying his biggest disappointment is decision-making on the court. And yeah, decision-making is a problem. I don't think there's any question about that. And I don't limit it to Trey McGowan and Xavier Johnson. You see bad shots all over the place, bad decisions all over the place. I remember watching the Virginia Tech game on Saturday night. It's just, I was actually talking to some other Pitt fans, during the game, and I said, that's just just shot after shot. That's a bad shot. That's a bad shot. You wouldn't take those shots in this program 10 years ago. And there's no compare. I complain about comparing this team too much to what Pitt was 3 years ago. I'm not going to compare it to what Pitt was 10 years ago because that's unfair. But decision-making has been a problem for this team top to bottom all season long. And it certainly does start with the guards. It certainly does start with those 2 guys that you came to expect on, or thought you were going to, not to expect on, to rely on. Those guys you were expecting to rely on this season. They've certainly not been great. They haven't been great in their decision-making, but I don't limit it to just them. You see things every game where you're scratching your head. You're scratching your head. As always, we have a cold one, and I think everybody deserves it tonight. Everybody earned it with this game on Saturday. Saturday, what am I even talking about? This is what happens when I tape a podcast too late at night. I forget what day it is, and I think it's 3 days earlier. Tuesday night, if you watch that game, you deserved a cold one, and we have the Voodoo Ranger American Haze. And we had a Voodoo Ranger Starship IPA a week ago. This one's a little bit different. We tell you about it because they support the podcast. You should support them. With notes of passion fruit and freedom, American Haze, this is a supremely drinkable, juicy, and unfiltered IPA brewed with all-American hops. And if you got a cold one, crack it because you earned it for watching that game. And it wasn't the worst game Pitt has played all season. They probably did that against Boston College. I would say was maybe the worst game they played. Or not Boston College. What am I talking about? What game am I talking about? Notre Dame. Notre Dame game might have been the worst game they played all season. Although, boy. I guess what I would say about this game on Tuesday night that maybe distinguishes a little bit is they were a game. They were competitive, and they were giving Florida State all they could handle, certainly in the first 5-6 minutes. I looked down at my notes and how they were competing. Even up in the 6-7 minutes into the game, they were ahead. They were up 15-7. after Au'Diese Toney made a three with some great passing from Trey McGowens and Xavier Johnson. I mean, they were up and really looked to not be in control of the game, but they were every bit the team that Florida State was. And then when they get into some foul trouble with Toney and Johnson and Champagnie, Florida State chips away. Florida State goes to a zone defense, and Pitt can't really do anything with that. Pitt goes to a zone defense, and Florida State keeps scoring. Pitt switch to zone doesn't really seem to work nearly as well as Florida State's does. And it's funny that after the game, Bunny Colvin said, or Leonard Hamilton said that Florida State, or not after the game, at halftime, he said that Florida State's zone offense looked like, or zone defense looked like they were standing in mud. I thought it was funny because I was like, wow, your zone defense was a whole lot more effective than Pitt's zone defense. So I think you guys were a little more successful at it than Pitt. But then Cable brings those guys back in. Champagnie and Johnson and Toney come back in the game and really do make a game of it. And maybe this one on Tuesday night ended up being a lot more frustrating than some of these other losses because you had a real chance. You were giving a top 10 team in the country a run for its money on its home court, and then they just blew you out of the building. I mean, just straight up ran you off the court. And they're blocking shots, and they're drawing flagrant fouls. They've got you losing your composure to where you're throwing an elbow. And look, I'm not going to sit here and claim that I know the intent of Au'Diese Toney on that elbow that he threw when he got the flagrant foul, but he absolutely should have gotten a flagrant foul. You bring your elbow up like that, never mind you're hitting the guy who's got stitches in his mouth. You may or may not have been thinking about that, but you bring your elbow up like that, and you just, I mean, you're gonna get called on that one. You're going to get that. That flagrant foul is going to be called, and rightfully so. I mean, it was an ugly play. It was a bad play. And so they've got you losing your composure. They're blocking shots. You get that play near the end where they get a T on Florida State because they block Xavier Johnson's shot. I mean, it's a mess. It's a mess. And, Colin Towle, it's Towle or Talley. I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Colin, but he's in the comments. He says, Trey McGowan should not start against Virginia. Okay, sure. Well, who are you going to start? You're going to put Ryan Murphy out there and give him starters minutes? And that's not to disparage Murphy or be rude about it. He played 9 minutes in this game against Florida State. Minimal impact. And, I don't know who else you start. I mean, Jeff Cable got the walk-ons in, but, I mean, what other guard do you have that you're going to start? Opposite Xavier Johnson. I understand you want to make an impact. You want to make a change. You want to do something and send a message, but you don't have anybody else. And when you come out on, what day is it? Saturday? Is that it's Saturday against Virginia at the Peterson Event Center? You got to go out and try and win that game to get the 7 wins in the ACC. You got to go out and try and win that game. And no matter how frustrated you may be by Johnson and McGowan's, no matter how frustrated Jeff Capel is by Johnson and McGowan's, I mean, you got to play your best players. And Trey McGowan's, Xavier Johnson, these guys are still Pitt's best guards, still the best options that Pitt has. And you come down, looking at the comments again. Grant D says if Ethio Horton is as good as people seem to have heard, what are the odds that he starts over Trey McGowan's? Because I see no world where Xavier Johnson, Au'Diese Toney, Justin Champagnie, and a center aren't starters. Look, next year is going to be really interesting to see what happens. Ethio Horton supposedly, the transfer supposedly has been really good in practice and could potentially even be a lead guard. I don't know who he starts over. I don't know if he starts over, McGowan's or Johnson, or they run 3-guard offense and start all 3 of those guys. But I mean, they get I know people talk about needing other players to step in here, and you got to start somebody else, or you got to play somebody over McGowan's, or next year somebody has to replace Johnson or McGowan's. I mean, those guys just have to get better. And I think we all expected that they would make a lot of improvement from year 1 to year 2, from their freshman year to the sophomore year. But I mean, and because they didn't make that improvement, I think it's fair to question whether they're going to make it from their sophomore to junior years. And that raises a big question of where those guys are going to be next season. I mean, have they hit a ceiling? Are they who they are? And that's it, that we've seen the best and the worst of what those guys can be and will be? I mean, possibly. But I think, look, we all have watched, and, Pit Parade just asked the same question. What if they've reached their ceilings? And that's that's a real question. But look, we've all watched the Pit program for a long time. I mean, I think most of us have. And we've seen players improve, right? We've seen guys that you really felt unsure about through their first year or maybe their second year. And we've seen players that didn't look very good in their early years with the programs. And we've seen them get better. We've seen guys show signs of improvement. Now, I don't think any of those guys that you would think back on, whether it was a Lamar Patterson or a Brad Wanamaker, I don't think any of those guys you would think back on necessarily had the starts to their careers that Trey McGowan and Xavier Johnson had. And that's maybe the thing that really stands out about those two guys and makes them unique, is that they kind of had strong starts to their careers. I mean, Trey McGowan's strong start to his career was kind of based around about 3 games or so, and drawing a ton of fouls in those games. Xavier Johnson, I think, was more consistent from the start of the season to the end of the season. And I don't necessarily think he's regressed. I know we've talked about regression with these guys. I just don't think he's gotten any better. I just don't think he's done any better. As a freshman, or as a sophomore, he hasn't improved in those areas where he thought he was going to improve. He hasn't gotten better as a shooter. He's not better as a passer. He's not better as a decision maker. And I don't know what you do with that. I don't know where you go from there other than you just keep coaching. And I don't think Jeff Capel has an option aside from just keep coaching. Just keep pounding away. And try to find ways to get the message through to these guys. Because he sees those moments too. I mean, and there are those moments, those flashes. I mean, it's not like Johnson and McGowan's haven't had good games at different points this season. They just haven't sustained it. You know what I mean? And it's not even like they've had, really, I mean, probably outside of very few examples, and certainly not many in the ACC, there hasn't been a consistent game for these guys where start to finish they've played really well. Never mind stretching it together over the course of a week or a couple weeks. They just really haven't stretched it together for 40 minutes. And they're playing a lot, and maybe that's part of it as well, but and there's a lot on their shoulders. You're relying on those guys to do a lot. They are the leadership. Somebody asked Scott Lynch, how much of this is due to a lack of upperclassmen leadership? I mean, I don't know, maybe. But I mean, those guys, I'm kind of in the camp that, I think Jamie Dixon used to say this. A lot of coaches will say that, freshmen, by the midpoint of their freshman season, they're not freshmen anymore. They've played 15, 20 games, whatever it is. They're not freshmen anymore. And I think McGowan's and Johnson and Tony, have played enough basketball over the last season and a half that they're upperclassmen for all intents and purposes. And I think they have to provide the leadership. And I'm not going to speak to what leadership they provide off the court. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it's like in the locker room. Somebody else on the live feed here asked about the locker room, and I don't know. I'm not going to pretend like I know. But what I see is on the court, and that product has been less than inspiring. Andrew, I don't want to mispronounce your last name, man, so I'm not going to say it, but says, my guess is this is more of a sophomore slump for Trey McGowan and Xavier Johnson, but hey, that's just me. And I would agree if I felt like there was a major regression. I would agree if I didn't think the issue was just that they haven't gotten better. Because, like we said, that brings up a bigger question of ceilings and whether they've hit a ceiling, And we're talking about those two guys individually. I think you still look and see Audice Toney. Audice Toney has gotten better from his freshman year to his sophomore year. Or you look and you see Justin Champagnie and you really like where he started out, and I think you can see a clear path to improvement for him. you can see areas where he can definitely get better. And that's exciting to see and promising to see, and you can look forward and project where he might be. Now, I think we all said the same thing about McGowens and Johnson last year at this time, and it didn't necessarily come to pass. But still, I think you can see some promising signs. Terrell Brown is Terrell Brown. What are you going to do? Who else is on this roster even? Ryan Murphy. I don't know what you expect out of him. I think there's been a lot of discussion about scholarship situations and whether they're going to have room to bring guys in, how many guys they're going to be able to bring in, and whether they're going to have one or more players move off the scholarship roster, underclassmen, guys who have eligibility remaining, and Murphy's name has been brought up as a possibility, as a speculation among fans. And I can see where that comes from. His role is diminished. Obviously he had a concussion. He missed some time with that, but he hasn't really stepped back into a primary role in this lineup. Like I said, he played 9 minutes against Florida State. Despite Florida State playing some uncomfortable zone for a decent chunk of that game, they still really couldn't get much from Murphy at all. What did he end up with? Two 3-point attempts, 1 of 4 from the floor. And that one was a long shot. It was initially, at least the announcers initially thought it was a 3-pointer. But they ended up ruling it a 2. But I don't know what Murphy's future is going to hold. And that brings in another question about the guards and whether you have enough guards on the roster, because even if, for whatever you want to say about Murphy, who was another guy who was out there who could play at the 2 and potentially even bring the ball up the court, and you're going to have Ethiel Horton to step in there, and maybe that affects Ryan Murphy's ultimate decision. I don't know. Again, that's him, and then we're a long ways off from seeing what would actually happen there. But if you lose Murphy to make room for bring in more guys, you replace him with Horton, but you still are left with sort of the same depth issues at guard that you've got this year. So, Murphy is a question mark. I'm trying to think. I mean, just running down the guys on the roster, who else even plays? Abdul Kareem Coulibaly gets on the court for 15 minutes on Tuesday night. I think he's shown some promise in his limited opportunities. He scored 6 points against Florida State, against a big, long front court that's not easy to attack, and he goes 3 of 3 from the floor and grabs 3 rebounds. That's a decent performance from him in 15 minutes. Gerald Drumgoole gets 2 points, both at the free throw line. He has an assist, 2 rebounds, a turnover, and a foul. I thought his assist was really sweet. That was a very nice pass. I think it was Brown, right? Terrell Brown. He just drove in real hard and then almost had a kind of a no-look pass, which I said, oh, okay, hey. Gerald Drumgoole getting beaten up every now and then about how he's been as a freshman. It seems like when we talk about Gerald Drumgoole, we forget, or it doesn't get brought up often enough. He missed a ton of time, due to injury. He sat out a bunch of games, and it's kind of, it seems like something important to hold on to. It seems like something important to reference. I'm trying to see if I can find the number. He's only played 13 games this season. And Pitt just finished up game, 27? So he hasn't even played in half of their games. And we're talking about where he is as a freshman. I mean, his freshman development was severely hindered by the fact that he missed a bunch of games due to an injury. I'm not writing off Gerald Drumgoole at all yet. And I think he looks comfortable with the ball in his hand. He definitely looks comfortable shooting. He didn't make any shots on Tuesday night against Florida State, but I think he looks comfortable shooting. I think he's a decent piece to keep on the roster. And not that it's really being considered to get rid of him off the roster, but I think I like his potential. I think in some of the lineup combinations they could come up with, if you mix and match with Drumgoole, Drumgoole, Champagny, and Tony, I think you can come up with some interesting wing combinations, especially with some of the guys that they're going to bring in for next year, either guys they already have locked up or guys that potentially could get. I think you can really get some interesting combinations on the wing. But again, you're going to need the guards to be more consistent, play better. You can't have 3 of 21. You can't have your 2 lead guards play 65 minutes combined and go 3 of 21. Just can't. And I don't know. Don't know what the answer is to it. Don't know how you solve the issues that they have. This Voodoo Ranger is really good. This American Haze, I highly recommend it. I always like all the Voodoo Ranger series from New Belgium, but this American Haze is a new one I think they have out. I think it's a seasonal. I don't think they're going to have this year round. So you definitely want to go find it whenever you can, because it's a pretty tasty drink. A couple of comments here in what we're seeing on the live stream, and appreciate everybody who's jumping in here. It's a little bit late at night, and so I appreciate you taking some time out to stop by the live stream and check it out. Let me see here. Pit Parade, lately Ryan Murphy's been less effective than Jared Wilson Frame. Absolutely. I mean, all season long, Ryan Murphy's been a less effective player than Jared Wilson Frame. I mean, Wilson Frame was a perfectly good shooter. Murphy may be a better shooter overall, but Wilson Frame was a perfectly good shooter for Pitt's offense and working with Pitt's young guards. I don't think there's any question about about that comparison. If you could pick one of those two guys to put on this roster right now, I think you would take Wilson Frame. I think you absolutely do that. But Royce Beacom, chimes in. Murphy's been off since his concussion, and I think that's true. Although I felt like he was hesitant earlier in the ACC schedule as well. Like, didn't have the success he needed to have when he was playing against Syracuse. Did he play in the Syracuse game? I just threw that one out because I forget if he missed that game or not. But look, I feel like we're splitting hairs here on a situation where the team, I don't know, are they underperforming to you at this point? I mean, really? Do we have to go back to 27 games ago and think about what our expectations were before the season? Do we cut it a little bit shorter where we start, cut the time frame back a little bit shorter where we start thinking about, well, okay, there was, a month ago, 2 months ago, we were talking about scenarios to get Pitt into the NCAA tournament or into the NIT. Do we have to compare it to those expectations, or do we do what the announcers did during the game where they say, and keep in mind, if Pitt wins just one more ACC game this season, they will match their ACC win total from the last 3 seasons combined. And I hate that. I'm getting really tired of that logic. And I wrote about it in the 321 column on Panther-Lair.com on Friday, and I hope you got a chance to check it out. I wrote some stuff in there about Jeff Capel and kind of his background and how he's offended by a game like the Clemson game. I think it was right. It was after the Clemson game. He talked about how he was offended by it and how he wasn't going to sleep after that game. And I wrote about that, but I also, what I wrote about was, kind of the shadow of the last 2 seasons or the last 3 seasons, the shadow of the 0-18 season in Kevin Stallings' second year at Pitt, and how at some point Pitt's going to have to get out of that shadow. We're going to have to stop using that as context. We're going to have to stop saying, well, this is where the program is, but look at where they came from. And so, you have to think about that. At some point, we're going to move past that. And I've kind of been hammering on this point for the last couple of weeks. Maybe because I thought that point was coming. Or maybe because I thought we were approaching that point when they beat, Carolina and Boston College and almost or should have beat Louisville at home and, gave Duke a run for their money in the second half and then finally beat Miami at home and, all this stuff. And, I thought we were getting past the point of using that 2017-18 season as context, that 0-18 ACC record as context. And I recognize that it's important. I recognize that you can't pretend like those seasons didn't happen. I recognize you can't pretend like this year's roster is not, or the construction of this year's roster was not impacted by those seasons and what, and how they went and just kind of that Kevin Stallings era. I appreciate that. And I realize you have to consider that context, but I'm kind of tired of hearing about it. It's time for this program to achieve on its own. It's time for this coaching, era to achieve on its own. And that's not to say that I'm fading on Jeff Capel. I still think he's absolutely the right guy for the job. I think he checks so many boxes that you want to check if you're Pitt and you're trying to hire a coach. I think he's almost perfect for it. But he would not take the 0-18 season as an excuse for where they are right now or what they're doing right now, nor should he. I'm just tired of thinking about it in that context. You know what I mean? I'm tired of hearing it being brought up. And I think, and I don't know if Capel would say this or not, but I think he's sort of hinted at it a few times, and this is one of the things I wrote about in the 3-2-1 column, is that, maybe the players hear that stuff too. Well, they didn't win any ACC games 2 years ago, so getting 3 last year and getting 6 this year, that's really good. Whereas Capel's sitting there saying, are you kidding me? Winning 3 ACC games is really good. Winning 6 ACC games is really good. Jeff Capel is coming to this with a Duke perspective. And the Duke perspective is that 6 ACC wins is not good if you've played more than 8 games. Right? And that's the perspective Pitt has to have. And I think that's the perspective Capel has. I don't know about his players. I don't know about fans. I don't know about media. I don't know about anybody else, but I do believe that's where Jeff Capel's coming from in this debate, this discussion, is that 6 ACC wins is nothing to be proud of. Getting 7 ACC wins is nothing to hang a banner over or celebrate, regardless of whether or not it matches the win total from the last 3 seasons combined. You got to do better than that. You have to aim higher than that. You have to achieve and aim to achieve better than that. And 404 Strang asks something right along those lines. Do you see next season being the year to step out of the Stallings era shadow? I mean, that's going to be up to the success of the team. Right? I mean, it should be. We shouldn't be talking about that era anymore. We shouldn't be talking about the context of 0-18 anymore. But the team has to have the success to make us forget about that. Because we've reached a point, and I do think we are at this point, we have reached a point where we're using that as a crutch. When this program falls on hard times, when they're not doing well, we talk about, but think of where they were 2 years ago. Think about how bad that season was 2 seasons ago. They've almost won as many ACC games as they did in the last 3 years combined. It's a crutch that we don't need to be using anymore with this program. But, I mean, we're talking in big terms, right? We're talking in big pictures, and what it comes down to is the players. And what it comes down to is the individual performances and the individual efforts. And there have been times this season when maybe you could have questioned the individual efforts. Not all the time. I think for the better part of this game on Tuesday night against Florida State, the efforts were really not questionable. Particularly in the first half and the first half of the first half, I thought Pitt was every bit as physical as Florida State. I thought they were taking the fight to Florida State. I think they saw those pretty blue uniforms and said, we're gonna mess you up right now. We're gonna come out and hit you and hit you hard. And they did, and they played really physical and they played really strong, and it was a really impressive performance. I think it waned at points in the second half, particularly as the game got out of hand. But it's not about effort, I don't think, as much as it's performance and finding some way to be consistently successful. And if that means, Capel insisting that those guys, I'm talking about the 2 guards, if it means Capel insisting that those 2 guys shoot less, if it means that he insists that they pass, however many number of times before they take a shot, go for it. Whatever you need to do, you've got to find a way to get this offense to work a little bit better. Their defense really kind of fell apart in the second half. Florida State ended up shooting 50% in the game. They actually shot 50% in each half. They shot it 50% in each half. They were 17 of 34 in the second half, 15 of 30 in the first half. So not great defense overall, but I mean, I thought Pitt, I mean, they gave up some easy baskets. Florida State ended up with 23 second chance points. Florida State got ridiculous production off their bench, 53 points off the bench, and of course 44 points in the paint, which I think you probably expect to some extent when you're going against Florida State. I mean, they've got a size advantage against a lot of teams in the country, and certainly against a team where you really have Terrell Brown as your lone big man. You bring in Abdul Kareem Coulibaly, again, who I thought gave a decent 15 minutes. Not a great 15 minutes, but a decent 15 minutes. But I mean, you didn't have the size or the depth of size to match what Florida State could throw out there. So I mean, it's not a surprise that Florida State ends up, winning the rebounding battle 40-27, getting 44 points in the paint, getting 23 second chance points. The rebounds actually, Florida State wins 40-27. At halftime, it was tied at 17-17. Pitt was rebounding with Florida State, but in the second half, they got out rebounded 23-10. So not going to have a lot of success when you're doing that. And of course, blocks too. Florida State blocked 6 shots. Pitt blocked 1. What do you say? It's the same sort of thing over and over, particularly against a superior opponent. I guess that would be one. It's not even a positive. I don't think it's a backhanded compliment because it's not a compliment at all. But I mean, one thing you would say is, well, they lost and they got more or less blown out by 15, and at least it was against a better opponent. They didn't. It's not like some of these other losses they've had recently, where they lost to Virginia Tech or Clemson. Or Notre Dame, where you question whether or not, Wake Forest, where you question whether or not, or Miami, where you question if it's actually, which team was superior and which team was inferior overall. Certainly on those days, Pitt was the inferior team. I think in this one, there's no question Florida State's the better team. Today, Tuesday night, and outside of that, Monday morning, they were the better team. Wednesday afternoon, they're going to be the better team. So I guess you have that going for you. But I don't know. It's another game, and there are going to be plenty of these kind of conversations the rest of the way. I mean, there's still Virginia, Syracuse, NC State, Georgia Tech in an ACC tournament game. There's a minimum of 5 games remaining, and it seems very unlikely that there's going to be more than 5 games remaining, but there's at least 5 games remaining for these Pitt Panthers, and I imagine we'll have this same kind of conversation at least a few more times. Now, look, Virginia's not what they've been in the past. Syracuse is beatable. I mean, Pitt showed that, I think, in the second half of the game at Syracuse. They can beat NC State. They can beat Georgia Tech. And they can win a game in the ACC tournament again. But they could have beaten Virginia Tech. They could have beaten Clemson. They could have beaten Notre Dame. They could have beaten Syracuse the first time around. They could have beaten Miami. They could have beaten Louisville at home. They had a real chance to do that. They could have beaten Wake Forest. I mean, This team has missed plenty of opportunities this season, and there's no reason to think they won't miss more over the final 5 games of this year. I think they'll win a couple more, or at least one more. Whether they get 2 remains to be seen. Hey, I should tell you about the website here as we're chatting. Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. It's the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet, football, basketball, recruiting. Find it all at Panther-Lair.com. And, of course, we have message boards where right now, as I tape this podcast, after Pitt's lost to Florida State, it's, pretty lively on the message boards. We'll go and check that out here once we get done with this live stream. But, it's a good place to go. It can be cathartic for Pitt fans. You want to go and talk about Pitt sports, particularly after a rough game and even in the midst of a rough game. You can go and do that, Panther-Lair.com. Pittsburgh.rivals.com. I think it's the best place for Pitt fans to go on the internet. So check it out, Panther-Lair.com. Check out Voodoo Ranger, American Haze. I highly recommend it. I've been enjoying it tonight, and I think you will as well if you check it out. It's very drinkable, 5% ABV. And it's just another really good one from New Belgium. I mean, they do it really well on a lot of their beers. And certainly the Voodoo Ranger is an outstanding one, so go check that out. Listen, we'll be back with another live stream next Tuesday night. We'll be there on 8:30 here on our YouTube channel. You can subscribe on YouTube to be reminded of that when we go live. And you can got distracted by the comment. David Robert, sorry, I don't want to mispronounce your last name, David, but nice compliment on the podcast, on the live stream, and I appreciate that. 8:30, we will be live streaming on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, Pantherlair.com. It's all one. It's all one word. So youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Go there, subscribe to the YouTube channel. We will be live streaming next week's podcast as well. We'll be talking more basketball, talk football, talk recruiting, everything going on in the world of Pitt sports. You hear it right here on the Panther-Lair podcast. So I appreciate you tuning into the live stream. I appreciate you checking out the podcast, and make sure you check out the website, get some Voodoo Ranger, American Haze, or anything from New Belgium. And have a good rest of the week, folks. We'll see you on the message boards. Enjoy the game on Saturday, and we will talk to you again next week.